The sun was setting, casting a rich, honeyed light across Route 66. The rays fell on the battered hood of the old Ford, reflecting in blinding light, as if the road itself were welcoming the returning traveler. Dust rose behind him, a misty veil obscuring the trail. John Matthews did not turn around. He squinted, looking ahead at the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching beyond the horizon, where his home awaited him. The wind, rushing through the slightly open window, ruffled his thick, dark hair, already touched with gray at the temples. Only 36, but war knows how to take years faster than time. 3 years of service abroad, hot spots, caravans, shouts on the radio, sand between the teeth, and the beating of the heart in the chest, when everything around me froze. They left traces on John, not only on the skin and in the eyes, but also in the soul. His face became rough. The tan did not lie in an even layer of a beach holiday, but in the burnt spots of service, and fine wrinkles settled in the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from sleepless nights, from a quiet tension that did not completely let go even at rest. He glanced at the passenger seat. There, next to his old army backpack, was a small teddy bear, a gift from Abby, which he had tucked into the backpack before leaving. The toy was a little faded, with a frayed ear, but to John it was a symbol, a reminder of what he had held on for. Among his few belongings was a photograph, folded in half, bent at the edges, but treasured. Melissa, her brown hair spilling over her shoulders, and little Abby, beaming with joy, a lollipop in each hand. He hadn't seen them in 3 years. Letters rarely arrived. Communications were spotty where he was stationed, and phone calls were like gulps of air in the depths. Sometimes he looked at the photograph again, closing his eyes, imagining himself holding his daughter's hand again. Melissa met him at the gate, in the same blue dress she was wearing when he proposed to her at dawn. He was coming back, to start over, to build a house, the one they had dreamed of before he left. A house with more than just a porch and a swing, but living walls filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the smell of homemade pie. He dreamed of quiet evenings on the porch, the sun sinking behind the hills, Melissa reading aloud in a blanket, Abby drawing on the steps with chalk. John adjusted the rearview mirror and caught his reflection. His eyes, once bright blue, now looked faded. There was weariness in them, but underneath it, there was determination. He exhaled, slowly, as if exhaling the dusty, scorched world he was leaving. "It's all over," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Now only forward. But somewhere deep down, beneath the surface of hope, there lurked a subtle, vague fear. Was he still the same? And would he ever meet the same family he had left behind 3 years ago? Bakersville greeted him with familiar sights: bungalows with faded signs, a Texaco gas station with a flashing neon sign, an old movie theater where he and Melissa had once gone on dates. The town hadn't changed much, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the quiet too oppressive for a Friday night, or the way people glanced at his truck and then looked away. John turned onto Maple Street, where their house stood, modest but cozy, with white walls and blue shutters. In the yard stood an old maple tree where Abby liked to play. He parked, turned off the engine, and stood for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. His heart was pounding. He had waited so long for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt a strange unease. What if everything had changed? What if they had changed? He grabbed his backpack, got out of the car, and headed for the porch. The door opened before he could knock. Melissa stood there. Her brown hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her face, though still pretty, looked tired. She was wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans, but her eyes, the same ones he'd fallen in love with 10 years ago, were watching him with cold caution. "John," she said, and there was none of the warmth in her voice he expected. "You're back." "Yes," he tried to smile, but it came out awkwardly. "I'm home, Mel." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. John walked into the house, containing his excitement. Everything was almost the same. The familiar smell of wood and cinnamon, the same worn couch, the old TV in the corner, the pictures on the mantel, the three of them at the beach, Abby in her elementary school graduation feed, him in uniform. But the air was different, heavier. There was an empty bottle of wine on the table and a glass with a reddish imprint on the rim next to it. John noticed it briefly and immediately became wary. Melissa never drank alone, at least not before. "Where's Abby?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but something anxious was already starting to clench inside him. "Upstairs, doing her homework," Melissa answered, crossing her arms over her chest. Her voice was even, almost too even. There was no warmth in it, no reproach, only weariness. John nodded, putting his backpack against the wall. He expected, even if cautiously, that she would at least hug him. That relief, joy would appear in her eyes. That she would cuddle up to him, like before, when he returned even from week-long training. But now it was as if there was something between them, invisible, but solid, like a wall of unspoken words. He was already heading for the stairs when Melissa's voice stopped him. "John." He turned around. She was standing there, looking down at the floor, fiddling with the sleeve of her sweater, a gesture he remembered from when they'd first started dating. Back then, it meant she was nervous. It meant she was nervous now, too. "She's changed," she said quietly. "Abby, she's grown up, John. Matured faster than she should have." John was silent, his lips pressed together. He felt how each of her words echoed with heaviness in his chest. 3 years is a long time for a child," Melissa continued, her voice shaking slightly. "When you left, she was still little naive, waiting for letters, drawing you pictures, writing to you in a notebook that she never got around to sending. And then she realized that you wouldn't be back soon, that you were far away, and she started to close herself off." She looked at him directly for the first time. "She's not angry. It's just, she barely remembers you as you were, and you're completely different now. We're all different, John." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to say something to justify himself, to promise, to return everything that had been. But words were not enough. Now they did not work. "Just." Melissa exhaled. "Give her time, and yourself too. All of us." John nodded silently and began to climb the stairs. Each step echoed hollowly, as if he were climbing not to his daughter, but to a new, unfamiliar life that he had yet to understand anew. He frowned but said nothing. He climbed the creaky wooden stairs and knocked on Abby's door. Silence. He knocked again, a little louder. "Abby, it's me, Dad." The door slowly opened. A girl stood on the threshold, not at all like the little girl in the photograph. She was already 10, but she seemed older, thin, with long dark hair falling on her shoulders. Her eyes, the same blue as John's, looked at him with caution, almost defiance. "Hello, baby," he said softly, stepping into the room. He tried to keep his voice calm, not to show how her gaze had pricked him wary, distant, not at all how he had imagined this meeting would be. Abby shrugged, not looking away. "Yeah, I see." Her voice was quiet, almost soundless, but there was a coldness to it. Reserved, mature, as if she was forcing herself not to feel too much. It hurt John more than any words. He stepped forward, arms outstretched, hoping to at least embrace her. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, but Abby instinctively stepped back, not roughly, not sharply, just. As if she were defending a boundary she was not ready to cross. He froze as if he had been hit in the chest. His hands slowly dropped. "I missed you," he said, almost in a whisper, his voice filled with pain that he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. "A lot." "Well, yeah," Abby looked away, directing her gaze toward the desk. She began rearranging her books, as if he hadn't managed to break her concentration. "I have homework to finish. I have a test tomorrow." Her calm was almost unnatural, as if she had rehearsed it in her mind beforehand. John stood in the middle of the room where he had once bounced her on his lap, told her stories, and fixed broken toys. Now it seemed alien, with stickers on the walls, adult books, and new frames with photos in which he was not. He nodded, even though every word she said was painful, as if someone was slowly untying the knots of his hopes. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll be downstairs. If you want, just come in. He waited for some hint of an answer, a gesture, a look. But Abby just turned back to her notebook, clicked her pen, and started writing something. For her, he had already gone beyond the boundaries of this space. He left the room, closing the door with an almost physical heaviness. His steps on the stairs echoed dully, and with each step the spark he had carried with him on the way home was extinguished. He wanted so much to turn back time, as if he hoped that simply returning would mean fixing everything. But it seemed that returning was only the beginning of the journey, and the most difficult path was no longer over sand and mountains, but to the heart of his own daughter. The evening passed in tense silence. Melissa had cooked dinner fried chicken and mashed potatoes, his favorite. But no one spoke at the table. Abby picked at her food with her fork, not looking up, and Melissa avoided his gaze, concentrating on her glass of water. John tried to lighten the mood by talking about his drive home, the road, how much he missed the Texas sunsets. But his words hung in the air, finding no response. After dinner, Melissa went to wash the dishes, and Abby disappeared back into her room. John was alone in the living room, staring at the fireplace where the fire was not burning. He pulled out an old notebook from his backpack where he kept his sketches, drawings of the house he dreamed of building. Simple lines, wooden beams, large windows to let light into the rooms. He had drawn these things during the long nights in the barracks, when the homesickness became unbearable. This house was his dream, his promise to Melissa and Abby. But now, sitting in this cold, alien living room, he began to wonder, did they want this dream? Later, after Abby had fallen asleep, John found Melissa on the back porch. She was sitting on an old wooden chair, looking at the stars. She had another bottle of wine in her hands, almost empty. John sat down next to her, but she didn't look at him. "Mel," he began carefully, "what's going on? You're not glad I'm back?" She was silent for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she turned to him, and there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite place, a mixture of weariness, pain, and perhaps anger. "John," her voice was quiet but firm. "You left. For 3 years. You left, and we stayed. And everything changed. I know it was hard," he said, feeling a lump in his throat. "But I did it for us. For the future. For the future," she cut him off sharply, her voice growing louder. "What future, John? Do you think I sat here and waited for you to come back and save us? I worked 2 jobs to pay the bills. Abby, she asked about you every day until she stopped. She stopped, John. She doesn't ask anymore." He felt her words hit him like fists. He wanted to argue, to explain, but he didn't know what to say. He knew his leaving had been hard on them, but he thought they would understand, that they would wait. "Mel, I want to make this right," he said finally. "I want to build a house, the one we dreamed of. We can start over." She looked at him, and for a moment he thought he saw a spark in her eyes, an old, familiar spark. But it quickly died. "Perhaps it's too late for that," she said quietly, rising. "Good night, John." She went into the house, leaving him alone under the stars. He sat there, looking out at the empty yard where Abby had once played, and felt his dream slipping away like sand through his fingers. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. The next morning, John woke up early. The horizon was just beginning to lighten outside the window, and the first ray of sunlight barely touched the windowsill, spreading a soft, warm light across the kitchen floor. The house was asleep, and in this silence there was a fragile hope, as if everything could start from scratch. He put the coffee on, pouring the grounds into the old coffee maker with a familiar motion, and while the water was boiling, he took out his notebook. He laid it open on the kitchen table, to the page with the sketches of the house. Straight lines, carefully drawn, with notes on the side veranda for rocking chairs. The window to the nursery faces south, swing under the oak tree. He painted it in foreign lands, to the sounds of gunfire, under the meager light of a tent lantern. Then it was not just a house, it was hope. A house to which he would return. A house where they would wait for him. The door creaked. He didn't look up at first, but he recognized the quiet footsteps. Abby. She walked in without looking at him, still in her pajamas, with faded teddy bears and stretched-out sleeves. She walked slowly to the refrigerator, opened it, and took some milk. Everything was as if according to a script of distance, polite indifference. But he felt how tense she was inside, as if every movement required effort from her. "Good morning, baby," he said, trying to make his voice sound light and cheerful. "Want me to make you some pancakes? With bananas. You used to love them, didn't you?" Abby glanced at him briefly, and there was no anger or warmth in it, just wariness, like a cat used to living in the shadows. "I'll do it myself," she muttered, pouring milk over the cereal, doing it so carefully, as if something more than just breakfast depended on it. John suppressed a sigh. He wanted to ask, "What happened? Why did you become a stranger? Why don't you even want to look at me?" But he knew it was too soon. Any attempt to get closer too quickly could destroy everything he had hoped to build. He pointed to his notebook, to the neatly written sketches. "You know, I was thinking," he began, trying to speak simply, like when she was little and built castles out of pillows. "Do you remember how we once talked about the house with the swings by the oak tree behind the barn? I drew it. Look there." Abby froze for a moment. His voice wavered with hope, a shadow of the old Abby in it. The one who laughed on his shoulders, the one who asked him to build a house with a window to the rainbow. He saw her eyes flicker across the page, for a second, briefly, almost imperceptibly, but then she turned away. "I don't care," she said quietly. Not rudely, just tired. And with a bowl in her hands, she left the kitchen and headed for the living room. John remained seated. The smell of coffee remained behind him, and on the table were drawings of a future that no one but him had seen yet. He slowly closed the notebook, placing his palm on top of the cover, as if he were pressing to his chest everything he still believed in. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it was lonely. But he wasn't going to give up. He'd missed too much, wasted too much time. And now he had only one way to go, forward, step by step, with patience, with hope. He would build this house. For her, for Melissa, for himself. Even if he had to lay the bricks one by one alone. Even if it's the last thing he does, he'll get his family back. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the old blinds, streaking across the wooden kitchen floor. John sat at the table, clutching a mug of cold coffee, and looked at his hands, calloused and rough from the last few weeks of working on the construction site. He had taken a job with a local construction crew, hauling lumber and mixing concrete in the hot Texas sun to save up for the materials for his dream home. But every night, when he returned to their old house on Maple Street, that dream felt further away. Melissa and Abby were close, but behind a glass wall, close but out of reach. John sipped his coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. He'd tried. He'd tried so hard. In the mornings, he'd made Abby breakfast peanut butter toast, the way she'd loved as a child, but she'd just eat it in silence, her head glued to her phone. In the evenings, he'd tell her stories about the stars he'd seen in the desert, hoping to spark a spark of interest in her eyes. But she'd just nod, her earbuds still in her ear. Melissa was even more difficult. She'd smiled, coldly, forcedly, but her words were short, and her eyes would slide past him, as if he were a ghost in his own house. "Good morning," he said as Melissa walked into the kitchen, adjusting the strap of her bag. She was dressed neatly, a white blouse, jeans, light makeup. "Too neat for a morning grocery run," she said. "Morning," she answered without looking at him, reaching for the keys on the table. "I'm going to the store. Abby will be down soon. Keep an eye on her." "Maybe I should come with you?" John suggested, trying to catch her eye. "We haven't been out together in a while." Melissa froze for a second, her fingers tightening on the keys. "No, I'll be quick. Lots to do." She turned to the door. "I'll be back in a couple of hours." The door slammed, and John was alone. He heard her car, an old Honda Civic, start and drive away. He stood up, went to the window, and watched her car disappear around the corner. Something about her demeanor, the haste, the avoidance of his gaze grazed him. Not for the first time. During the day, John worked at a construction site where a crew was building a new warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersville. The heat was unbearable, sweat pouring down his back, and dust clogging his lungs. But he didn't complain. The work took his mind off the thoughts that had begun to gnaw at him at night. Why was Melissa so cold? Why did she leave whenever he tried to talk? And why did Abby, his baby, look at him like he didn't belong? "Hey, Matthews," the foreman, a big guy named Ted with a beard like a wire brush, called out. "You seem like you're on another planet today. Everything okay?" John wiped the sweat from his forehead and forced a smile. "Yes, Ted. Just. Family matters." Ted chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "I know what it's like. You come back from the war, and everything at home is not as you dreamed, right? Give them time. They'll get used to it." John nodded, but Ted's words did not reassure him. He was not sure that it was just a matter of time. Something was wrong, and he felt it more and more. After his shift, he returned home, tired but determined. He decided that today he would try to talk to Abby. Maybe she would open up if he found the right approach. He went into the garage to get some tools he had started to set up the backyard, digging a hole for the foundation of a future deck. But when he opened the garage door, he froze. There was a car there. Not their Honda. A black Dodge Ram, shiny as if it had just come from the showroom, with chrome wheels and tinted windows. John frowned. He knew for a fact that the garage had been empty when Melissa had left that morning. He walked closer, ran his hand over the hood. It was warm, as if it had been driven recently. On the back seat was a leather jacket, clearly a man's, and a pack of Marlboros. John's heart began to beat faster. He walked back into the house, trying to keep his composure. Melissa was sitting in the kitchen, sorting through bags of groceries. She looked calm, almost too calm. "Mel," he began, trying to keep his voice even. "Whose car is in the garage?" She didn't turn around, continuing to lay out the cans of beans. "Oh, this. A friend was asked to hold it for a couple of days. He's away, and there's not enough space in his yard." A friend. John narrowed his eyes. "What friend?" "Just an acquaintance from work." She shrugged, her voice light but tense. "What kind of interrogation, John?" He wanted to ask more, but something in her tone, sharp, almost challenging, silenced him. He nodded, though inside he was seething. "I was just asking," he said, stepping back. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to Melissa breathe evenly next to him, and thought about the car, about the jacket, about cigarettes. He didn't know this friend from work. Melissa had never mentioned anyone in particular, and the casualness of her answers, the ease with which she brushed off his question, only made him more suspicious. The next few days were the same. Melissa would leave in the morning, always with an excuse: the store, the drugstore, a friend's appointment. John noticed little things that hadn't caught his eye before. Her phone, which she now kept with her at all times, the new password on her lock screen that hadn't been there before, her habit of quickly changing the subject when he asked about her day. One day, he saw the Dodge in the garage again, even though Melissa swore it was already with its owner. When he asked about it, she rolled her eyes. "John, stop it," she said, her voice shaking with irritation. "Don't you trust me? I told you, it's none of my business. I'm just helping a man." He didn't answer, but a decision was already forming in his mind. He didn't want to be the one spying on his wife. He hated the thought of it. But doubt gnawed at him like rust, and he knew he couldn't live without knowing the truth. The next day, he stopped at a local electronics store and bought a small camera, a simple one with Wi-Fi that he could connect to his phone. The salesman, a skinny guy with a pimply face, chattered away, but John was barely listening. All he could think about was how he was going to mount the camera in the garage, pointing it at the driveway. He didn't want to believe Melissa was lying, but he had to know. That night, while Melissa and Abby were asleep, he snuck into the garage. He worked quietly, setting up the camera in the corner, behind an old box of Christmas decorations. He checked the app on his phone. The image was clear. The angle of view was wide enough to cover the entire garage. If anyone came, they would see it. Back in the bedroom, he lay down next to Melissa, but he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the clock ticking on the wall, and felt his heart squeeze with fear. Not fear of what he would find out, but fear that the truth would destroy everything he had tried to hold on to. The next day, he went back to the construction site, but his mind was elsewhere. He checked his phone every half hour, opening the camera app. Nothing. The garage was empty. He returned home in the evening, tired but determined to spend time with Abby. He found her in the living room, watching some TV show on her tablet. "Hey, baby," he said, sitting down next to her. "Want to help me in the yard? I've started digging for the porch. Maybe we can do something together." Abby looked at him, her eyes empty. "I don't want to," she said, returning to the screen. "Abby," he tried to smile, "I know it's been complicated, but I'm here. I want us to be a family again." She was silent, her fingers hovering on the screen. Finally, she looked up. "You left," she said quietly, but her words were sharp as a knife. "You left, and we stayed. And now you come back and think everything will be like before? It won't." John felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to explain, but she had already gotten up and gone upstairs, leaving him alone. He sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, thinking that maybe he had lost not only Melissa, but Abby too. Late that night, when the house was quiet, John opened his camera app. His phone screen lit up his face, and he froze. The camera recorded movement. A black Dodge Ram pulled into the garage at 3:17 p.m. A man tall, wearing a dark jacket, got out and walked toward the back door of the house. John zoomed in, but his face was blurry. He rewound the footage. The man was in the house for about an hour, then left. Melissa returned 20 minutes later in her Honda. John turned off the phone, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. He didn't want to believe it. But the truth was staring him in the face, and it was colder than he could have imagined. Night had fallen like a heavy blanket over Bakersville, muting the sounds of the street. John sat in the darkened living room, lit only by the dim light of his phone. His fingers shook as he opened the camera app again, even though he already knew what he would see. The footage from the garage, taken during the day, was short, but each frame was seared into his memory like a shard of glass. A black Dodge Ram pulled into the garage at 3:17 p.m. A tall man in a dark jacket got out, straightened his collar, and walked toward the back door of the house. The camera didn't get a clear shot of his face, but something about the way he walked confident, with a slight swagger, struck John as though he knew something. He rewound the footage over and over until he noticed an emblem embroidered on the man's jacket, a small eagle he knew all too well. John put the phone down, feeling a searing pain build in his chest. He didn't want to believe it, but the truth was too obvious. He knew that jacket. He knew that walk. He knew that damn Dodge. This was Dan, his best friend, his co-worker, the man he trusted more than himself. Dan, who had stayed in Bakersville when John had gone overseas. Dan, who had promised to look after Melissa and Abby. The Dan who had looked after them too well, it seemed. John stood up and paced the room, trying to catch his breath. His thoughts were a jumble, his emotions clashing like waves in a storm. He wanted to storm into the bedroom, wake Melissa, and demand an explanation. He wanted to grab his keys, drive to Dan's, and beat the truth out of him. But another part of him, the part that had survived the desert, learned to keep its cool under fire, told him he should be smarter. Should have more evidence, should be sure, even though deep down he already knew. He sat down on the couch, covered his face with his hands, and tried to remember when it all went wrong. His thoughts wandered back to the past, when he and Dan were inseparable. 10 years ago. The dusty bar on the outskirts of Bakersville was buzzing with the clinking of beer bottles, laughter, and the dull rhythm of old country music playing from a battered jukebox against the wall. The air was thick with the smell of fried bacon, cheap tobacco, and something else, something simple and familiar. Everyone and everything was known here, but no one asked too many questions. John and Dan sat at the counter, freshly dressed in army fatigues, the sleeves slightly frayed, recently returned from camp, tired but cheerful. Their faces shone with youthful confidence. They were in their early 20s. The world seemed clear. The future was simple and attainable. "Listen, Matthews," Dan began, winking at the bartender who was already pouring another round. "If you do marry your Melissa, know this. I demand that you be the best man. And don't try to skimp, there has to be an open bar at the wedding." He slapped John on the shoulder so hard he almost spilled his beer. John laughed, leaning against the counter and shaking his head. "Agreed. Just don't get drunk, damn it, or you'll forget how to say ladies and gentlemen." "A speech?" Dan theatrically put his hand to his chest. "You're insulting me, brother. I was born for the stage. I'll say something that will make even your mother-in-law, even if she were made of reinforced concrete, cry like a child." They clinked their bottles. The bottles clinked dully, and John caught himself thinking that he felt warm. But not from alcohol. From confidence. From a simple but rare feeling to know that there is a person nearby whom you can rely on at any moment. Dan wasn't just a friend. He was the brother John never had. They grew up together, fighting local bullies for school and honor, running away from Brenda Thompson's older brother, to whom they both took turns trying to give gum. Then came army training, long months of dirt, pain, sleeplessness, and, despite everything, unity. When John started courting Melissa, it was Dan who pushed him to believe in himself. "She's not just good, she's for you," he said one day, watching Melissa walk away through the park with a book in her hand. "If you miss this, I'll kill you myself." When Abby was born, Dan showed up at the hospital looking like he'd just won a championship. He dragged a nearly life-sized teddy bear into the room and declared, "This is so that the girl knows from childhood that she has protection." And when the order came, the very one that meant that John was going abroad to serve in the hot lands, it was Dan who came up, hugged him tightly, and said what John remembered verbatim. "Don't worry about them. I'll look after them. Melissa, Abby, the house, you'll come back and everything will be back in place. I swear." And then John believed, unconditionally, the way only brothers are trusted. Because before that night in the bar, before the bear, before the words about the stage and the toasts, there were years, stacked together like bricks in a foundation of trust. He didn't know that so much would change in those 10 years, that the words spoken in a smoky bar would one day become an echo that would resound loudly in his chest. He opened his eyes, stepping back into the dark living room. Now those memories burned like hot iron. Dan. The same Dan who had sworn to be there, who had held him before he left, who had promised that everything would be okay. How could he? How could Melissa? John felt the anger mixing with the pain, creating a suffocating lump in his chest. He wanted to scream, to smash something, but instead he just sat there, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The next 2 days passed in a blur. John worked at the construction site, mechanically performing tasks, but his mind was elsewhere. He checked the camera every night, hoping and dreading that he would see something else. Melissa was her usual self, distant, but without any obvious signs of guilt. She cooked dinner, talked to Abby about school, even smiled at John occasionally, but her smiles were as empty as a burnt-out desert. Abby remained withdrawn, spending her evenings in her room, and John felt like he was losing her with each passing day. On the third day, the camera picked up movement again. John was sitting in his truck after his shift, parked 2 blocks away so Melissa wouldn't see him. He opened the app and started recording. The Dodge pulled into the garage at 2:45 p.m. The same man got out, but this time he turned to face the camera, and the light from the garage light illuminated his face. John froze. It was Dan. No doubt about it. The broad shoulders, the short blonde hair, the slight smirk that John always found so familiar, so friendly. Dan walked into the house through the back door, and the camera caught him returning to the car an hour later. Melissa followed him out, fixing her hair. They exchanged a few words that the camera didn't catch, and Dan drove away. John turned off the phone, feeling the world crumble around him. His hands were shaking, his breathing ragged. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel, hard enough to rock the truck. The pain in his knuckles was sharp, but it didn't stop the pain that was tearing him apart inside. He sat there, staring out at the empty street, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of him wanted to storm into the house, to throw the tape in Melissa's face, to demand the truth. But the other part of him, the part that still loved her, despite everything, was afraid of the truth. Afraid it would destroy everything they had left. And Abby, how could he tell his daughter that her mother, her family, everything she knew, was a lie? He remembered another moment from the past. The night before he left for abroad. He and Dan were sitting in the backyard of the house, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, looking at the stars. Dan had said, "You come back, Matthews. Don't you dare die there. Your girls are waiting for you." John then laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You look after them, okay? I'm counting on you." Dan nodded, seriously, without his usual smirk. "I won't let them down, brother." The words were mocking now. John felt Dan's betrayal cut deeper than Melissa's. Melissa was his wife, but Dan was his brother. They shared everything: laughter, pain, fear. Dan knew what his family meant to John, and he took it anyway. John got home late after Melissa had gone to bed. He couldn't look at her, couldn't lie next to her, knowing she was with someone else. He went down to the living room, poured himself a whiskey from an old bottle he found in the closet, and sat down on the couch. The alcohol burned his throat, but brought no relief. He took out a notebook of sketches of a house, his house, their house. He flipped through the pages, looking at the neat lines of the porch, the swing, the big windows. That dream was all that had kept him in the desert, all that had given him the strength to come home after the nightmares. But now it seemed as empty as the house, like his marriage. He thought about what to do. A confrontation with Melissa was inevitable, but he didn't know how to approach it. If he showed her the tape, she might deny everything. Or worse, confess, and then their marriage would fall apart completely. And Abby? How could he protect her from this? He couldn't let her know that her mother and his best friend had betrayed them. But he couldn't stay silent either. The truth burned like a hot coal, and he knew he couldn't live with it without doing something. The next day, he decided to talk to Dan. Not on the phone, not via text message, but face to face. He knew where to find him. Dan worked at the body shop across town, the same one where they had worked on their first cars as teenagers. John got in his truck and drove there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers were numb. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know if he could stop himself from hitting Dan, but he had to hear it from Dan. He had to understand why. The shop was just as he remembered it, smelling of oil and rubber, with the hum of tools and the clank of metal. Dan stood by the lift, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up as John entered, and his face twitched for a moment, then broke into his usual grin. "Matthews," he said, coming closer. "Damn, how old? How are you, brother?" John felt anger flare in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. Dan narrowed his eyes, but nodded. "Of course. Let's go to the office." They walked into a small room littered with papers and empty Coke cans. John closed the door, turned to Dan, and looked him straight in the eye. "What are you doing in my house, Dan?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Dan froze, his grin slowly fading. "What are you talking about, brother?" "Don't call me that." John stepped closer, clenching his fists. "I saw you on camera in my garage with my wife." Dan's face turned pale, but he quickly pulled himself together. "You're wrong, John. I just stopped by to help Melissa with the car. Nothing special." "Don't lie to me," John barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "I saw you coming into my house, saw you coming out. An hour, Dan. An hour. What were you doing in my house with my wife?" Dan stepped back, raising his hands. "Listen, calm down. You got it all wrong." "Then explain," John nearly shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "Explain why you betrayed me. You promised to look after them, and instead of you." He couldn't finish. Dan looked at him, and there was something in his eyes that John hadn't expected, not guilt, not fear, but pity. "John," Dan said quietly, "you left. For 3 years. You left them. Melissa, she was alone. She needed someone. And I. You took advantage of this. John stepped forward, his fists shaking. You were my friend. My brother. How could you? Dan was silent, his eyes downcast. The silence was heavier than any words. John turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass shook. He climbed into the truck, tears stinging his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything. The dim light from the kitchen table lamp cast long shadows on the walls as John sat hunched over a stack of papers. His eyes, bloodshot from lack of sleep, scanned the lines of an old prenuptial agreement he had dug out of a box of papers. The yellowed pages smelled of dust and time, but the fine print was as clear as the day he and Melissa had signed them. Her father, an old-fashioned lawyer with a stern look and a perpetual cigar, had insisted on the agreement before they were married. John had laughed at it then, certain that their love needed no paperwork. Now he thanked the old man for his foresight. 2 weeks had passed since he'd seen Dan on camera. 2 weeks of oppressive silence, strained conversations, and John trying to keep his cool. He didn't yell or make a scene, even though every time he looked at Melissa, he felt his insides clench with pain and anger. He didn't want to be the one smashing furniture or screaming in the middle of the night, scaring Abby. Instead, he'd decided to act, coldly, calculated, like a soldier who knew that wars were won not by emotion, but by strategy. John put the contract down and rubbed his temples. His plan was simple, but it took time and precision. He was collecting evidence not to humiliate Melissa, but to protect himself and Abby. The security footage was stored on a flash drive in a safe in the garage. He took screenshots, noting the dates and times Dan showed up at their house. He even started keeping a journal, recording the oddities in Melissa's behavior. Her late arrivals, her evasive answers, the calls she answered in a whisper, going into another room. It was excruciating, but he forced himself to be methodical. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall. He was building around his resolve. The next morning, John drove into downtown Bakersville, where the lawyer Ted, his foreman, had recommended to him had his office. Roy McKinley was a man in his 50s with thick gray eyebrows and a habit of tapping his pen on his desk. His office was cramped and piled high with files, but it smelled of expensive cologne and confidence. John sensed immediately that this man knew his stuff. "So, Mr. Matthews," Roy began, adjusting his glasses, "you want to file for divorce? Reason?" John swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. Saying it out loud was harder than he expected. "Treason," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I have proof. Videos, recordings, everything you need." Roy nodded, not showing surprise. He had clearly seen many such stories. "Good. Do you have a prenuptial agreement? That would make things much easier." John pulled out a folder and handed it to the lawyer. Roy flipped through the pages, chuckling a couple of times. "Your father-in-law was a smart man," he said, tapping his pen. "This agreement is ironclad. The house is in your name, as is most of the property. If you prove adultery, and from what you say, it won't be difficult, Melissa gets only her personal belongings. No alimony, no divisions. Are you sure you want to go all the way?" John looked out the window, where a tractor was crawling down the street, raising a cloud of dust. He thought about Abby, about how she would live without her mother, about how he would explain to her why everything had fallen apart. But the thought of continuing to live with a lie was unbearable. "I'm sure," he said, meeting Roy's gaze. "I want everything to be legal, and I want to protect my daughter." Roy nodded, writing something down in his notebook. "Then let's begin. I'll prepare the documents. We'll need your evidence, but don't worry, I'll make sure everything goes smoothly. Are you prepared for the fact that she might make a scene?" John grinned, but there was no joy in his smile. "She has already arranged it for him. She just doesn't know about it." John spent the next few days in a strange state, calm, almost cold on the outside, but a storm raging inside. He continued to work at the construction site, hauling boards and pouring concrete, but every blow of the hammer was like an outburst of anger. In the evenings, he came home and pretended that everything was fine. He cooked dinner, asked Abby about his homework, even tried to joke with Melissa, although her presence now caused only a dull pain in him. She did not notice the change in him, or did not want to notice. She still left in the mornings, citing work, and returned with bags from the supermarket as if nothing had happened. But John saw everything. He noticed the way she checked her phone when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she avoided his questions about where she'd been, the way her smile tightened when he talked about the future. He knew she was seeing Dan. The camera in the garage kept recording his visits not every day, but often enough that John had no doubt. He saved every record, every detail, like a soldier preparing for battle. One evening, after Abby had gone to bed, John was sitting on the back porch, looking at the stars. Melissa came out to him, holding a mug of tea. She looked tired, but there was something new in her eyes, a wariness, as if she sensed something was wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked, sitting down next to him. "You've been kind of quiet lately." John looked at her, and for a moment he wanted to spill it all. To tell her about the camera, about Dan, about the pain that was eating away at him from the inside. But he held back. Not the time. Not now. "I'm just tired," he said, looking away. "Construction is exhausting." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual. John felt his heart clench. He still loved her, or at least he loved the Melissa he'd known. But the woman sitting next to him was a stranger, and he couldn't pretend he didn't notice it any longer. 2 weeks later, the papers were ready. Roy called John into his office to sign the papers. The divorce decree sat on his desk, neatly typed, with the precise clauses that would tear their marriage apart. John read each line, feeling his throat tighten. This wasn't just the end of their marriage, it was the end of his dreams. The home he wanted to build, the family he wanted back. But he knew there was no other way. "Are you sure?" Roy asked, looking at him over his glasses. "There's no going back after this." John nodded, signing the papers. His hand didn't shake, even though everything inside him was screaming. He had signed not only the divorce, but also custody of Abby. He wasn't going to let Melissa take her. Not after everything. "When will she find out?" he asked, putting his pen down. "This evening," Roy replied. "I'll send the paperwork to her lawyer. If she doesn't have one, she'll have to hire one. But given your agreement, she has little chance of contesting anything." John nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten a little. But the relief was bittersweet. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to destroy their family. But Melissa had made a choice, and now he had to protect himself and Abby. That night, John came home late. He had stayed late at the construction site, not wanting to be home when Melissa received the documents. But when he walked into the living room, he realized that she already knew. She was standing by the fireplace, clutching an envelope with the logo of the law firm. Her face was pale, her eyes were red, but there was anger in them. "What's this?" she asked, her voice shaking but full of challenge. "You're filing for divorce? Without a conversation? Without warning?" John closed the door, trying to keep his composure. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he felt as if a stone had been crushed under him. "I know, Mel," he said quietly. "I know about you and Dan." Her eyes widened, but she quickly pulled herself together. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was sharp, almost hysterical. "You don't believe me? Do you think I'm cheating on you?" "I don't think so." John stepped closer, his voice firmer. "I saw it. I have footage. The camera in the garage. Dan. You. Everything." Melissa froze, her face growing even paler. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. John looked at her, expecting her to deny, to lie, to scream. Instead, she sank down on the couch, covering her face with her hands. "John." Her voice was barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." He felt his anger flare up again, but he held it in check. "You didn't want to?" He almost laughed, but it was bitter. "You slept with my best friend, Mel. You ruined everything we had. And now you're telling me you didn't want to." She looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. But John felt no pity. Not now. "I was alone," she said, her voice shaking. "You were gone, John. For 3 years. I was alone, with Abby, with the debts, with all of it. Dan, he was there. He helped. And I—" "Enough," John cut her off. "I don't want to hear it. You made your choice. Now I make mine." He turned towards the stairs, but her voice stopped him. "And Abby," she cried, "you want to take my daughter, my home, everything?" John stopped without turning around. "The house is mine," he said coldly. "The contract your father made us sign, remember? You'll get your things. But Abby's staying with me. I won't let her grow up with you after all this." Melissa jumped up, her face contorted with rage. "You can't," she screamed. "You won't take her. I'm her mother." "Then act like a mother," John said, finally turning to face her. "Not like." He trailed off, unwilling to say the word. "Pack your things, Mel. It's time for you to go." She looked at him, her chest heaving with her heavy breathing. For a moment, it seemed she was going to throw herself at him, but instead she collapsed back onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. John went upstairs, his heart breaking. He didn't want this. He didn't want to see her cry. He didn't want to destroy their family. But she had destroyed it first. The next day, Melissa left. She packed a suitcase, a few boxes of clothes, and drove away in her Honda without saying a word. John stood on the porch, watching her car disappear around the corner. Abby was at school, and he was grateful for that. He didn't know how he was going to explain to her why her mother was gone. But he knew he had to protect her. He had to give her the home he'd promised, even if that home was now just for the two of them. He walked back into the living room, where the envelope with the papers was still lying. He picked it up, feeling its weight. It was the end. But maybe it was also the beginning. He didn't know how their lives would turn out, but he was ready to fight. For Abby, for their future, for the dream that still lingered in his heart, despite everything. As the autumn wind blew fallen leaves across the sidewalks of Bakersville, John stood in a vacant lot outside of town that had once been an abandoned farm. Now it was filled with the hum of excavators, the clanking of metal, and the voices of workers pouring the foundation for what would become an apartment complex. This was his new project, not just a home for himself and Abby, but something more. A veterans foundation he called Bulwark. It would be a lifeline for those like him who had returned from war to find their place in the world occupied by shadows. As John watched the bulldozer level the lot, he felt something welling up in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Melissa had left 3 months earlier, and her absence had left a void in the house, but John refused to let himself sink into melancholy. He rose each morning, made coffee, drove Abby to school, and drove to the construction site, where his crew had grown accustomed to his quiet determination. At night, he worked on the foundation, writing letters to old Army buddies, reaching out to local businessmen, seeking investors. His connections from the Army were stronger than he had expected. Colonel Reynolds, his former commanding officer, now with a veterans organization in Austin, supported the idea and helped connect him with major donors. Within a month, the foundation had received its first grants, and a local bank had agreed to finance the construction. John wasn't just building houses, he was building a future for those like him who knew the price of giving back. Abby was still distant, but there were moments when he saw the old intimacy flicker in her eyes. One evening, she helped him sort plans on the kitchen table, and though she said little, her questions about the project were sincere. "Dad, will there be a swing set like you wanted?" she asked, and John smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that they were on the same page. He promised there would be a swing set for all the children whose parents found refuge at the stronghold. But not everything went smoothly. The town was buzzing with rumors, and Dan's name was on everyone's lips. His firing from City Hall was a sensation. The security camera footage that John had given to Roy, his lawyer, had somehow found its way to a local journalist, a young guy named Lucas, who worked for the Bakersville Post. John hadn't planned it that way. He wanted the divorce to be quiet, for Abby's sake. But Lucas, with his keen eye for scandal, had uncovered the details. Dan, who held a position in the city planning department, had used his position to engage in shady deals, including forging land deeds. When the security camera footage of him at John's house surfaced in the newsroom, it was the last straw. The mayor, not wanting a political scandal, fired Dan for ethical violations, even though everyone in town knew there was more to it. Now Dan, once a respected man, was an outcast, his name mentioned in hushed tones in bars and gas stations. John felt no joy in the fall of his former friend. He felt only weariness and emptiness, but it gave him a strange sense of freedom, as if the last fragment of the past that had held him in chains had finally crumbled. He could move on. On a chilly October day, John was at a veterans organization meeting in Austin, pitching the Stronghold project. The room was packed. Former military, their families, a few local politicians and donors. John stood at the podium, wearing a plain plaid shirt, clutching a clipboard with a presentation in his hands. He didn't like speaking, but the words flowed easily, speaking about things he knew the hard way. About coming home, about feeling lost, about the need for a place where veterans could start over. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and several people came up to shake his hand. Among them was a woman whose face he immediately noticed not because of her beauty, though she was attractive, but because of the quiet strength in her gaze. "Emma Clark," she said, extending her hand. Her voice was warm but slightly husky, as if she were used to saying little but making a big difference. "I represent Veterans for Tomorrow. Your idea, it's important. I want to help." John shook her hand, noting how her fingers, thin but strong, lingered in his palm a little longer than necessary. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her green eyes were so direct that he was momentarily taken aback. "Thank you," he said, trying to compose himself. "We need all the support we can get." Emma smiled, and there was something in her smile that made his heart flutter. Not passion, not love, just a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. They started talking after the meeting, over coffee in a small diner nearby. Emma explained that her husband, Captain Jake Clark, had died in Afghanistan 5 years earlier. She was left alone with her 2-year-old son, Liam, and had since dedicated herself to helping veterans. Her foundation was small but powerful, and she knew how to get grants and attract volunteers. John listened, impressed by her resilience. She didn't complain, didn't seek pity, just did her job, just like he did. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking at him over the top of her teacup. "Oplot isn't just a construction site. It's personal, isn't it?" John nodded, looking out the window at the people hurrying down the street. "I came home and there was no home," he said quietly. "My family. Everything fell apart. But I don't want anyone else to go through that. I want to give them a place to start over." Emma looked at him, and there was no pity in her gaze, only understanding. "I know what it's like," she said, "to lose everything that was important. But you're doing something real, John. That's rare." He smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that someone was seeing him not the soldier, not the betrayed husband, but the man trying to piece himself back together. The conversation dragged on, and as they parted, Emma gave him her business card. "Call me if you want to discuss the project," she said, a hint of playfulness in her voice. "Or just talk." John nodded, feeling warmth spreading in his chest. He wasn't ready for anything new. The wounds from Melissa and Dan's betrayal were still raw. But Emma was different. She didn't demand anything, didn't push, but her presence was like a breath of fresh air after being in a stuffy room for so long. Back in Bakersville, John threw himself into his work. Construction on the stronghold was well underway. Foundations had been poured. The first frames of houses were already rising above the ground. He spent his days at the site, coordinating workers, checking drawings, and negotiating with suppliers. At night, he sat in the foundation's office, a small room he rented downtown, answering emails, filling out grant applications, and meeting with volunteers. Emma came over a couple of times, bringing ideas and donor contacts. They worked late into the night, discussing plans, and John found himself looking forward to her visits. not because of romance, though he couldn't deny that he was attracted to her, but because of how easy they were together. She understood him without asking unnecessary questions. Abby, meanwhile, was beginning to thaw. She was still withdrawn, but she would occasionally come to the construction site, watching the houses go up. Once, she even picked up a hammer and helped pound in a few nails, to the mocking encouragement of the workers. John looked at her and felt that maybe they could build something new, not just a house, but a relationship. But the shadow of the past did not disappear. Rumors about Dan continued to circulate around town. After he was fired, he tried to get a job at another shop, but his reputation was ruined. Lucas, the journalist, published an article hinting at Dan's affair with a married woman without naming names, but everyone in Bakersville knew anyway. John tried not to read the papers, but news reached him through Ted and the other workers. Dan had left town, rumored to be in Dallas, but no one knew for sure. Melissa had also disappeared from view. She had rented an apartment in the next county and had not tried to contact John. He was grateful for this, but every time Abby asked about her mother, his heart sank. One evening, Emma arrived in Bakersville with her son, Liam. The boy was 7, and he was the spitting image of his mother. The same green eyes, the same curious energy. Abby, to John's surprise, hit it off right away. They ran around the vacant lot, playing tag, while John and Emma sat on folding chairs, watching. "She's a good girl," Emma said, looking at Abby. "She's like you." John chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know if it's good. I'm not the easiest person." Emma looked at him, her eyes warm but serious. "You're doing the best you can, John. It's more than most." He wanted to answer, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, feeling her presence calm him. They sat in silence, listening to the children's laughter, and for the first time in a long time, John felt that maybe he was on the right track. By the end of November, the first oplot homes had begun accepting tenants. They were simple but cozy buildings with large windows and small courtyards. John personally met the first veterans, helping them move in. Among them was a guy named Miguel, a former Marine who had lost a leg in Iraq. He shook John's hand so hard that his fingers hurt. "Thank you, brother," Miguel said, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what this means." John just nodded, not trusting his voice. He knew what it meant. He knew it too well. Emma continued to help, bringing furniture, blankets, even toys for the children. Their visits became more frequent, and John found himself thinking about her even when she wasn't around. It scared him, not because he was afraid of feelings, but because he wasn't sure if he was ready to trust again. But Emma didn't rush him. She was there when he needed her, and she gave him space when he wasn't. One day, as they were finishing unloading a truck of materials, Emma touched his hand, lingering her fingers on his wrist. "You're doing something incredible, John," she said quietly. "Don't forget that." He looked at her, and there was so much warmth in her eyes that he felt his walls crumble. He didn't answer, but he squeezed her hand back, and that was enough. The stronghold grew, and so did John's hope. He knew there was still work to do with the foundation, with Abby, with himself. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward, not back toward pain and betrayal, but toward something new, toward a life he could build. The morning in Bakersville began with noise, not the kind that came from the construction site of the stronghold, where John now spent most of his time, but the buzz of voices in the local coffee shop, the gas station, and the line at the supermarket. The usually sleepy town seemed to come alive, fueled by a fresh dose of gossip. The headline on the front page of the Bakersville Post read, "City Hall Scandal, Corruption, Personal Ties." The article by Lucas, the same journalist who had first uncovered the dirt on Dan, did not name names directly, but the hints were clear. Everyone in town knew that it was about Dan Wilson, a former City Hall employee, and his affair with a married woman whose husband had recently returned from military service. John did not want it to get out, but now that the body camera footage his lawyer had released was in the hands of the press, there was no stopping the tide. John sat in his truck, parked at the construction site, leafing through the newspaper that Ted, the foreman, had handed him. The article was detailed. Lucas had unearthed not just records, but financial documents that showed Dan had used his position to swindle city land. His firing now looked like something bigger than an ethical violation. But that didn't matter to John. He tossed the paper onto the passenger seat and got out, heading toward the site where workers were erecting the frames for the new stronghold homes. He didn't want to think about Dan. He didn't want to think about Melissa. He wanted to build not just homes, but a new life for himself and Abby. But the city was not going to remain silent. By midday, the news had reached the construction site. The workers were whispering, casting curious and awkward glances at John. Ted approached him during a break, holding a bottle of water. "Have you heard what they're writing about your friend?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They say he's persona non grata now. Even in Dallas, they won't hire him." John shrugged as he hammered a nail into a wooden beam. "I don't care where he is or what happened to him," he said without looking up. "He made his choice." Ted nodded without pressing the point. He knew John wasn't the type to talk about his wounds. But the news about Dan was just the beginning. By evening, the rumors had grown to include a new detail. Dan had left town, leaving behind a trail of debts and a ruined reputation. No one knew where he had gone. Some said Oklahoma, some said Mexico. But one thing was clear. He had fled, leaving everything behind, including Melissa. Melissa lived in the next county over, in a small apartment above a Chinese restaurant where the smell of fried rice permeated the air. The divorce left her homeless, without savings, and, as it now turned out, without Dan. John found out by accident when he walked into Roy, his lawyer's office, to discuss the final details of Abby's custody. Roy, tapping his pen on the table, mentioned that Melissa had been trying to contact him, demanding a renegotiation of the divorce. "She's desperate," Roy said, looking at John over his glasses. "She says she's broke. Her boyfriend, or whoever he is, disappeared without a cent. She can't even afford a lawyer." John sat looking out the window at the cars driving down the street. He felt no joy at her fall, but he felt no pity either. She had destroyed their family, and now she was reaping the consequences. "She's not getting anything," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "A deal is a deal, and Abby is staying with me." Roy nodded, writing something down in his notebook. "I thought so, but she might try to make a scene. Be prepared." John just chuckled. He had seen enough scenes. Now all he wanted was for his daughter to be safe and for his project to move forward. Meanwhile, Stronghold was gaining momentum. The first houses were already occupied, and the veterans John helped began calling him not just by his first name, but Matthews, with respect, like in the Army. Miguel, the same Marine who had lost his leg, now worked in the Foundation's office, helping with paperwork. His energy and sense of humor were infectious to everyone around him, and John often found himself smiling as he told his stories. But the most important thing for John was that Abby began spending more time at the construction site. She would come after school, sit on toolboxes, and watch the work. Sometimes she would ask questions about how foundations were built or why the windows were so big. John would answer patiently, enjoying every word. Emma became a part of their lives, too. She came up from Austin once a week, bringing Liam, her son, and boxes of donated items for the residents of the Stronghold. Her foundation, Veterans for Tomorrow, became an official partner, and together they worked on grants, vendors, and plans for expansion. John noticed Abby and Liam bonding over games together or arguing over whose turn it was to choose what to watch on the tablet. It was strange, seeing his daughter open up to someone new, but it gave him hope. One evening, Emma stayed late at the Foundation's office, helping John sort through grant applications. They sat at a desk littered with papers, drinking coffee from plastic cups. The lamplight reflected in her green eyes, and John realized he was looking at her longer than he should have. "What?" she asked, noticing his gaze. A slight smile touched her lips. "Nothing." John looked away, feeling his cheeks warm. "Just, thank you for everything you do." Emma shrugged, but her smile widened. "It's not just for you, you know. I believe in what you do, and I like being around you." He looked at her, and for a moment the room was silent. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck. Instead, he simply nodded, and she, as if understanding, did not press the point. They returned to their papers, but there was something warm, elusive, in the air. Meanwhile, Melissa was trying to pick up the pieces of her life. Without Dan, without money, without support, she was stuck. She waitressed at a diner where her shifts started at 6 in the morning and ended after midnight. Her apartment was cramped, with a leaky faucet and windows that didn't close properly. She called Abby, but the conversations were short. Her daughter answered in monosyllables, and Melissa felt like she was losing her. She blamed John, she blamed Dan, but deep down she knew she had ruined everything. One day, she decided to come to Bakersville. She parked her old Honda outside John's house and knocked on the door. He opened it, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Melissa looked exhausted. Her hair was a mess. There were dark circles under her eyes. But there was determination in her eyes. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. John stepped back to let her into the living room. He didn't want this meeting, but he knew it was inevitable. "About what?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Everything has already been said." "Not everything," Melissa clenched her fists. "You ruined my life, John. You kicked me out, took my daughter away, and now the whole town's laughing at me because of this article." "I ruined it?" His voice grew sharper. "You slept with my best friend, Mel. You ruined our family, not me." She opened her mouth to protest, but fell silent. Her shoulders slumped, and she sat down on the couch, looking at the floor. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said quietly. "Dan, he was there when you weren't. I was alone, John. You don't understand what it was like." "I was in the war," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "I wasn't on vacation, Mel. I did it for us, and you." He fell silent, unwilling to continue. Melissa looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. "I want to see Abby," she said. "She is my daughter. You can't keep her away from me." John looked at her, feeling his anger give way to weariness. "You can see her," he said finally, "but according to my rules, and only when she wants to." Melissa nodded, wiping her eyes. She stood up and left without another word. John watched her car drive away and felt the last thread that connected him to the past snap. The stronghold continued to grow. By December, 3 more homes were completed, and John began planning the second phase. Emma visited more often, and their conversations grew more personal. She talked about her husband, how she had coped with his death, how Liam had become her anchor. John shared stories about his time in the service, his dreams for a home, his fear of letting Abby down. They didn't talk about their feelings, but they both knew something was growing between them. Abby, meanwhile, began to open up. She came to the construction site more and more often, helping paint the walls or carry tools. One day, she asked John if they could make a playground for children at Oplot. He promised that it would be the first thing they built in the spring. Her smile at that moment was more valuable to him than all the grants and sponsors. John knew there was more work to do. Melissa might come back, demanding more. The city might tire of his project, and the sponsors might change their minds. But he looked at the houses rising in the vacant lot at Abby, who was starting to smile at Emma, who was at his side, and he knew he was on the right track. Dan and Melissa's downfall was not his victory, but their choice. His choice was to build, and he wasn't going to stop. Bakersville had had a mild winter with few frosts, but on the day the first Bulwark housing project opened, the sky was clear and the air was crisp, with a faint scent of pine from the nearby forest. John stood on a makeshift stage made of wooden pallets in front of a crowd of veterans, their families, locals, and a few journalists, including Lucas from the Bakersville Post. Behind him rose 6 new homes, simple but sturdy, with white walls and large windows, which he had helped design. It wasn't just a complex, it was a symbol of how he had risen from all that had tried to tear it down. John adjusted the collar of his shirt, feeling a little awkward at the attention. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but today was his day. Emma stood next to him in a navy coat, with Liam tugging at her arm, trying to get her attention. Abby stood a little further away, holding a sign she'd drawn herself that said, "Welcome to the Stronghold." Her eyes, usually so guarded, were proud today. "Thank you to everyone who came," John began, his voice firm but with a hint of excitement. "This project started with a dream. Not mine, but ours. Everyone who knows what it's like to come home and find that home is gone. We built a stronghold for those who deserve a chance to start over, and I'm proud that we did it together." The crowd applauded, and John felt the tension in his chest ease. He looked at Emma, who smiled at him, and at Abby, who for the first time in a long time looked at him without a trace of resentment. This was the moment he had been working for all these months. After the speech, the ceremony began. Miguel, a Marine who now helped run the foundation, cut the red ribbon at the entrance to the first home. Veterans and their families, the first residents, toured their new homes, their voices mingling with children's laughter and the sound of music from speakers someone had set up on the lawn. John moved among the people, shaking hands, answering questions, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was thinking about how far he'd come, about how the pain of Melissa and Dan's betrayal had turned into something more, a force that drove him forward. Emma was everywhere, helping distribute food, talking to volunteers, showing Liam and Abby how to hold a hammer when they decided to help put up a sign. John watched her from afar, feeling a warmth in his chest. She hadn't been part of his plan when he came back to Bakersville. He hadn't thought he'd be able to open up to anyone again. But Emma had come into his life quietly, unobtrusively, and now he couldn't imagine it without her. Abby, to his surprise, was also drawn to Emma. After the opening, the three of them, John, Abby, and Emma, were sitting on a bench outside one of the houses, eating hot dogs and watching Liam run across the grass, trying to catch the kite Miguel had flown. Abby, usually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Emma, have you ever built anything?" she asked, looking at her with curiosity. Emma laughed, putting down her hot dog. "Not really. I'm more of a paperwork person. But I did help my husband fix his fence once. He did say I was better at holding a hammer than hammering nails, though." Abby giggled, and John froze at the sound. He hadn't heard her laugh since he'd returned. He looked at Emma, who winked at him, and felt something in him thaw. Abby continued to ask Emma questions about her son, about her job, about how she learned to drive a truck. Emma answered with patience and a touch of humor, and John saw that his daughter, for the first time in a long time, seemed at ease. Later, as the guests began to leave, Emma approached John holding an empty sandwich tray. "It's a good day," she said, looking at the houses. "You did it, John." "We did," he corrected, meeting her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled, and her eyes softened. "You could have handled it, but I'm glad I was there." He started to say something else, but Liam ran up, demanding that Emma watch him learn how to tumble. John watched her walk away with her son and felt his heart beat a little faster. It wasn't the giddy feeling he'd gotten for Melissa when they were younger. It was different, calm, mature, like the warm light at the end of a long day. The next few weeks were busy. The bulwark became the center of attention not only in Bakersville but beyond. Lucas wrote another article, this time about the project itself, calling John the man who brought hope back to veterans. The article made it into major Austin newspapers, and soon more donors began reaching out to John. He hired 2 more staff members to help manage the influx of veterans wanting to live at the bulwark. Miguel became his right-hand man, coordinating move-ins and helping new residents adjust. Abby changed too. She began spending more time with John, helping out at the construction site or in the office. Her questions became deeper. She wanted to know why he decided to help veterans, how he was coping with his mother gone. John answered honestly but carefully, trying not to hurt her feelings. One evening, as they sat on the back porch of their house, Abby suddenly said, "Dad, I know what Mom did. I heard people talking. And I'm not mad at you." John looked at her, feeling his throat tighten. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way, baby," he said quietly. "I wanted us to be a family." Abby nodded, looking at the stars. I know, but I like what you're doing now. This bulwark, it's cool, and Emma's cool too. John smiled, ruffling her hair. Yeah, Emma is cool. Abby looked at him, her eyes serious. You won't leave again, will you? He shook his head, feeling her words hit him right in the heart. Never, Abby. I'm here. Always. She pressed herself against him, and he hugged her, feeling her warmth drive away the cold that had lived inside him for so long. Emma began coming to Bakersville more often. Sometimes she brought Liam. Sometimes she came alone to help with paperwork or discuss new ideas for the foundation. John noticed how her presence changed the atmosphere, not just in the office, but in his life. They often stayed up late, drinking coffee or just walking through the vacant lot where work on the second phase of the stronghold would soon begin. Conversations flowed easily about the past, about plans, about the challenges of being a single parent. John told her about Melissa, about the pain of betrayal, about how he feared losing Abby. Emma listened without interrupting, and her silence was as supportive as her words. One day, as they were sorting through boxes of donated books for the Oplot Library, Emma suddenly stopped and looked at him. John, can I ask you something? Her voice was cautious. Have you ever thought about starting over? Not just with the stronghold, but with someone? He froze, holding a stack of books in his hands. The question caught him off guard, but he knew what she meant. I have, he said, looking into her eyes. But I'm not sure I'm ready. After everything, I don't want to make a mistake again. Emma nodded, her gaze soft but direct. I understand. I was scared too. After Jake, I thought I'd never be able to. But then I realized that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just keeps happening. John looked at her, feeling her words sink into him. He didn't answer, but he took her hand and squeezed it, and she squeezed it back. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than any words could. By spring, the stronghold was home to 20 families. John walked the complex, checking on everything, and every time he saw children playing on the lawn or veterans sitting on the porch, he felt like he was doing something important. Abby now spent almost every day after school, helping with small chores or just chatting with Liam, who had become her best friend. Emma came every week, and their visits became a ritual: coffee, conversation, long walks. One day, as they stood outside the new house they had just finished, Emma turned to John. Are you happy? She asked, her voice quiet but sincere. John thought about it. Happiness was a word he hadn't used in a long time. But looking at the houses, at Abby running with Liam, at Emma standing next to him, he realized the answer was simple. Yes, he said, not like before, but yes, I'm happy. Emma smiled, and her hand found his. They stood there, looking out at the stronghold, and John knew this was just the beginning. Not just a complex, not just a new life, but something bigger. Something he was building not just for others, but for himself. Spring had brought warmth to Bakersville, and the vacant lot where the stronghold now stood was alive with greenery. Grass was sprouting between the paths, and young oak trees planted by volunteers were already providing shade. John stood at the edge of the playground where the residents' children were playing ball, watching Abby teach Emma's son Liam how to properly hold a baseball bat. Her laughter, ringing and sincere, was proof to him that he was doing everything right. Stronghold was now home to 30 families, and every day brought new applications from veterans seeking shelter. John worked tirelessly, during the day at the construction site, in the evenings at the foundation's office, but the fatigue was easy because he saw the results. His life, which had seemed like ruins just a year ago, was now taking shape, like the houses he was building. Emma had become an integral part of his world. She came up from Austin almost every weekend, helping with events for the residents or just hanging out with John and Abby. Their relationship was slow and unhurried, but John felt her presence filling the void left by the betrayals of the past. Abby had grown attached to Emma too. They baked cookies together, argued about what movies to watch, and even began planning the playground for the stronghold that John had promised to build. For the first time in a long time, He felt like his daughter trusted the world again. But the past, like an old wound, sometimes reminded itself. John knew that Melissa lived in the next county, worked as a waitress, and occasionally called Abby. Their conversations were short, and Abby rarely went into detail, but John saw how her face darkened after these calls. He did not forbid her from talking to her mother, but every time her name came up, he felt something squeeze inside. He forgave her, or at least tried to convince himself that he did, but it was impossible to forget. On Friday night, as the sun set, painting the sky orange, John sat in the foundation's office, checking accounts. Emma was in Austin to meet with a new donor, and Abby was at a friend's house for the night. The office was quiet, except for the hum of the old air conditioner. John was reaching for another folder when he heard a knock on the door. He frowned. Visitors were not expected at this hour. He opened the door and froze. Melissa stood there. She looked different than the last time they had met. Her hair was neatly done, her clothes were simple but clean, and she was holding a small bag. Her eyes, still familiar, looked at him with an uneasy mixture of hope and fear. "John," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "May I come in?" He stepped aside to let her in. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. He didn't know what she wanted, but he was ready for any conversation. Melissa walked into the office, looking around the desk covered in papers and the board with plans for new homes. "The place looks impressive," she said, sitting down on a chair. "I've heard about your project. Everyone's been talking about it." John sat down opposite, crossing his arms. "What do you want, Mel?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of steel in it. She swallowed, fiddling with the strap of her bag. "I want to talk. About us. About Abby. About everything." He narrowed his eyes, feeling old wounds begin to ache. "There is no us, Mel. You know that. The divorce is signed. It's over." Melissa's gaze widened, her fingers tightening. "I know what I did, John. I know I ruined everything. But I've changed. I want to try again. For Abby. For what we had." John looked at her, two emotions warring in his chest. The anger he'd suppressed for so long, and the weariness of everything she'd brought into his life. He remembered their first meeting, her smile, her laughter, dancing to the radio in the old pickup. But then he remembered the security footage, Dan in their house, her lies, and that memory trumped everything. "You think it's that easy?" he asked, his voice even but pained. "You think you can go back and fix it? After?" "I know what I did," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "I was desperate, John. You left, and I couldn't cope. Dan was there for me, and you weren't. But he left, abandoned me like I meant nothing. And now I see what I've lost. I lost you, Abby, everything." John shook his head, his jaw clenching. "You lost us when you made your choice, Mel. You betrayed me when I was on the other side of the world, risking my life for our family. You betrayed Abby when you brought him into our home, and now you want me to just forget." Melissa stood up, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said, her voice growing louder. "I'm asking you to give me a chance. I want to be a part of Abby's life. I want to be with you. I know you still love me, John. I can see it." He stood up, taking a step toward her, but stopped at a distance. His gaze was firm, but not angry. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "I loved you. For a long time. But what you did, it broke something that can't be fixed. I won't forget, Mel. I forgave you for me, for Abby. But I'm moving on, and you should too." She looked at him, her face twisted in pain. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. John stood there, looking at her, feeling the last pieces of their past fall to the floor. He felt no joy in her pain, but he felt no pity either. She had made her choice, and he had made his. "Abby can see you," he said finally, "whenever she wants. But it's her decision, not yours or mine. And as for us, we're gone." Melissa looked up. Her eyes were red, but she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. "I just wanted to try." John didn't answer. He opened the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Melissa stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out without looking back. He watched her silhouette disappear into the twilight and closed the door. The silence of the office embraced him, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the silence of completion. The next day, John returned to work with renewed energy. He spent the morning at the site, checking on the progress of the second phase of the stronghold. Miguel was there, as always, coordinating the workers and making fun of their laziness. John smiled as he argued with a young man about how to properly hold a drill. Stronghold had become more than a project. It was his home, his mission, his way of making a mark. Abby arrived after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She found John outside one of the houses where he was helping install windows. "Dad, can I help?" she asked, her voice light, almost playful. John handed her the screwdriver, showing her how to tighten the screws. She worked with concentration, and he watched her, feeling pride well up inside him. They talked about small things about school, about the new movie she wanted to see, about how Liam had tried to teach her how to skateboard and nearly broken his arm. John laughed, and his laughter was genuine, free of the weight that had weighed on him for so long. That evening, Emma arrived with Liam. They brought boxes of books for the Stronghold library, and Abby quickly whisked Liam away to show him the new site. John and Emma were left alone, sorting through the boxes in the small room that would soon become the reading room. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, noticing his thoughtful look. John nodded, placing the books on the shelf. "Melissa came by yesterday," he said, his voice calm. "She wanted to come back, start over." Emma froze, her hand stopping on the box. "And what did you say?" "That it's over," he said, looking into her eyes. "I don't want to look back. I want to move forward. With Abby, with the stronghold, and with you if you want." Emma looked at him, a slight smile touching her lips. "I will," she said quietly, "but only if you're sure." John stepped closer, his hand finding hers and squeezing her fingers. "I'm sure," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice. They stood there, surrounded by books and silence, and John felt the last shadows of the past recede. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. The stronghold continued to grow. New houses were built, new families moved in, and John watched his dream become a reality. Abby smiled more often, her bond with Emma grew stronger, and even Liam became part of their little family. John knew life would not be easy. There were bills, supply chain issues, land disputes with the local government. But he was ready for it. He had been through war, betrayal, and pain, and he had survived. Melissa never came back. She called Abby, and sometimes they met at a coffee shop in the next county, but John kept his distance. He had given his daughter the freedom to choose, and she seemed to be beginning to understand that her place was with him, with the stronghold, with the new life they were building together. John looked out over the complex at the people who now called it home and felt like he had found his place. Not what he had been looking for when he returned to Bakersville, but something more. He had forgiven Melissa, but he had not forgotten, and that forgiveness gave him the strength to move on. It had been 2 years since the night Melissa stood in the Bulwark office, begging John for a second chance. 2 years that had changed everything. Bakersville, once a quiet town, was now buzzing with life, thanks in large part to Bulwark, which had become not just a local project, but a national symbol of hope for veterans. John Matthews, a man whose life had once fallen apart, was now at the center of this new world he had built with his own hands. But this was more than just a triumph. It was a story about how the choices you make in your darkest moments define who you are. John stood on the porch of the big house he had finally built, not the one he had pictured in his notebook in the desert, but a new one surrounded by oak trees, with a swing in the yard, like he had promised Abby. The house was simple but warm, with wide windows that let in the sunlight and a wooden porch where his family now sat. Emma, his wife, sat in a wicker chair, holding their 1-year-old daughter, Sarah, on her lap, tugging at her hair and laughing. Abby, now 12, sat on the steps, showing Liam how to make a bracelet out of yarn. Liam, Emma's son, now called John Daddy, and the word, spoken with a childish casualness, made John feel like he was home every time. The Bulwark Foundation grew far beyond Bakersville. Within 2 years, John and Emma had opened branches in 5 states, from Texas to Oregon. They built not only housing complexes, but also veterans centers, places where former servicemen could get jobs, education, and psychological support. John often traveled to openings, spoke to crowds, but now he felt no awkwardness. He spoke from the heart, talking about the importance of giving people a chance to start over, because he knew that better than anyone. Emma was there. Her organizational talent and ability to find common ground with people turned Bulwark into a machine that ran smoothly. They were a team, and that was more than John could have dreamed of. Abby now called Emma Mom. It hadn't happened overnight. There had been months of awkwardness, conversations, tears. But Emma had never rushed her, never pressured her, just been there, helping her with her homework, listening to her teenage worries, teaching her how to cook, laughing at her jokes. One day, when they were baking a cake for Liam's birthday, Abby had said, "Mom, pass me the vanilla," and Emma had frozen, her eyes filling with tears. John, standing in the doorway, felt his heart clench with happiness. Abby had chosen them, not just him, but Emma too, and that was more important than any house ever built. Melissa lived in the next county over, in a small rented apartment above a car wash, where the smell of detergent and the noise of the machines permeated the thin walls. She worked at the local school as a cleaner from early morning until late at night, mopping floors and scrubbing desks. Her life was quiet, lonely, but stable. She didn't call Abby as often anymore. Their meetings had dwindled to the occasional cup of coffee at a diner every few months. Abby was polite but distant, and Melissa felt her daughter slipping further and further away. She didn't blame her, she couldn't. She knew she'd ruined their connection. Sometimes Melissa would drive past Bakersville, and her gaze would always fall on John's house. She would see the swing in the yard, hear the children's laughter coming from the windows. She knew that he had married Emma, that they had a daughter, that his foundation had become legendary. And every time she looked at that house, she would feel a pang of regret, sharp as a knife, but dulled by time. She did not try to go back. After that last conversation in the foundation's office, when John told her that he had forgiven but not forgotten, she knew that the door to their past was closed forever. Melissa wasn't broken. She found a job, paid her rent, even started going to a local church, where she sometimes sang in the choir. But loneliness was her constant companion. Dan, who had run away 2 years earlier, had never resurfaced. Rumor had it that he was working as a mechanic somewhere in Mexico, but Melissa didn't care. He was part of her mistake, part of the past she had tried to leave behind. But the past followed her like a shadow, and every time she saw the posters for the Stronghold or heard John's name, she knew she had failed. That evening, John sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was pink and streaked with gold, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Emma sat next to him, holding Sarah, who was falling asleep against her shoulder. Abby and Liam argued over whose turn it was to choose the movie that evening, their voices mingling with the cicadas. John watched them, a smile tugging at his lips. This was not the happiness he had known in his youth, the fiery, reckless kind. This was a mature, calm feeling, forged in pain, but all the more precious for it. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, her voice soft as the evening air. John turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers, and he felt warmth spreading in his chest. "About how far we've come," he said, "and about how lucky I am." Emma smiled, her hand finding his and their fingers intertwining. "We're both lucky," she said, her voice full of the same warmth he felt. Abby ran up to them, holding a bowl of popcorn. "Dad, Mom, are you coming? We've picked a movie." She looked at them, her eyes shining. "It's going to be a comedy," Liam lost. Liam, who had caught up with her, rolled his eyes. "She cheated," he said, but his smile showed that he was not too upset. John laughed, standing up and taking Sarah from Emma. They walked into the house, where the TV was already on, the light from the screen falling on the walls, creating a cozy atmosphere. John looked at his family, Emma, Abby, Liam, Sarah, and knew he had won. Not over Melissa, not over Dan, but over himself. Over the pain, over the fear, over the darkness that had once threatened to consume him. The Veterans Center that John opened in Bakersville was the heart of Bulwark. It was a large building with classrooms for training, counseling rooms, and a room where veterans could gather, share stories, or just be quiet together. Miguel, now officially the center's manager, gave tours to new residents, his voice booming like a drill sergeant. John stopped by often to check in, but mostly he just listened as people talked about how Bulwark had changed their lives. Each story was confirmation that he had made the right choice. Emma became his partner in everything, not just his work, but his life. Their wedding was a small one in the garden of the stronghold, with Abby and Liam as best men. Abby was the ring bearer, and Liam tried to catch a butterfly during the ceremony, making everyone laugh. John looked at Emma that day in a simple white dress and knew that this was the beginning of something real. Not a fairy tale, not a dream, but a real life that they were building together. Melissa, living her quiet life, sometimes saw articles about the stronghold in the newspapers. She read them in her apartment, and her heart sank. She wasn't angry, the anger was gone, leaving only emptiness. She knew she had chosen her path, and now she had only to live with it. She wrote letters to Abby, but the answers came rarely, and Melissa accepted that as part of the price she paid for the past. John sat on the porch, holding Sarah, who was now fast asleep. Emma was snuggled against him, her head on his shoulder. Abby and Liam were still arguing in the living room, their voices coming through the open door. John looked out at the sunset, at the stronghold houses in the distance, at his family, and smiled. He had won not because Melissa had lost, but because he had chosen loyalty. Not just to others, but to himself. Loyalty to his principles, to his daughter, to his new beginning. The moral of his story was simple but profound. Loyalty is not just a word. It is an action. It is a choice you make every day. And those who betray will eventually face the consequences not because of revenge, but because life always pays back debts. John had made his choice, and now he looked at the sunset knowing that his debt was paid. Friends, thank you for being with us. Subscribe if you enjoy stories like this. There's a lot of exciting content ahead. We do our best for you, and any support is a huge motivation to keep going. If there's anything we can improve, let us know in the comments kindly. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.